Willie is here to provide an open discussion, if you will. We were blessed to have him worship with us a little more than a month ago here at Mount Olive. And I'm going to embarrass him a little bit, but he sings beautifully as well.
He should start off with this.
But I think what he is doing and what he has done and continues to do raises issues and concerns for all of us. And oftentimes we tend not to say anything, and we accept things as they are, not realizing that our voices do matter. And that there is an obligation that we have as citizens, and as far as this book is concerned, as parents, to intercede on behalf of our children and not let them feel as though they can be treated any kind of way by someone just because they hold a position of authority in society. So having said all of that, I'm going to turn it over to Brother Willie. Bless you.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening. I thank you for the invitation. I thank God for allowing me safe travel to get here. I don't take that for granted. I left New York, as my name badge says, Smarty Pants from New York. So you'll find that as I'm talking, you'll probably be like, look at that Smarty Pants. Who does he think he is? But anyway, as was stated, my name is Willie Jones. I am a person who kind of was dragged into this. I'm sure as a lot of you probably feel about yourselves, I would rather, if at all possible, stay in the background, just do what it is I do, enjoy my life to the fullest, and not make too many waves. But if you are a Bible student, and I'm sure most of you are, you recognize that most of the greatest prophets were reluctant prophets. They did not want to do what they wanted, what God ended up having them do. They would rather have lived a quiet life, do their thing, unassuming, but God had something else in their destiny. And so one of the things that God, I believe anyway, has put in my destiny is to call to the attention of the world, most specifically the country in which I was born and the country in which I reside, the United States of America, what it is that God would have to say through me to the people who reside here as well. So, having said that, I greet you with the Sanskrit word namaste. Ancient Sanskrit meaning the divinity in me salutes the divinity in you. Put another way, you have intrinsic value. Or in other words, you matter. You matter to the Most High God, and you matter to me. Unfortunately, in our country, as this book talks about, there is a need for reminder periodically to the United States that all lives should matter. So in a sense, I do agree with the statement, all lives matter. But the way things happen in the United States, from 1619 to 2018, there is a need for a strong suggestion and a critical eye and a constant reminder that Black lives matter too. And that three letters, that TOO, are an important addendum to the phrase Black Lives Matter. And that meaning is baked into the phrase. So it's not Black Lives Mattering over and above anyone else's. It is we see things happening and consistently showing things to be a certain way that we have to tell America, Black Lives Matter too. Now, I always say this, as a person who has been black for more than 40 years, I recognize that America, because I'm a good student, I loved school when I was in school, and one of my favorite classes in school was what they call social studies, the study of history, and American history was one of my favorites. And so the lofty words of people like Thomas Jefferson, who cribbed his notes from people like George Mason, but we'll get to that another day. People like Thomas Jefferson came into permanent notice and permanent place of honor for having crafted the words of the founding documents of the United States. Some of my favorites are ones I'm sure you've memorized as well. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain. In other words, we take out a contract with ourselves and with God. Ordination. You see the connection there. We establish something based on that ordination, based on that compact with ourselves and with our God. We have certain things we're going to do and certain ways that we think about ourselves. Here's another one. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, in the midst of this writing, in the midst of this great lofty thinking, there was a problem that wasn't addressed. And I like to say America has had bouts with early onset dementia. From the beginning of the United States, it was a baby, it was in the crib, and it was suffering from its own form of Alzheimer's. There was a split in its thinking that made it operate one way, even in the midst of talking about itself in another way. I always talk about American myth making. And some of the myths came from the very beginning. So, since we're in church, let me start off with a portion of scripture. I'm going to be reading something taken from 1 Samuel chapter 16, verses 10 to 11. This is the story of when the prophet Samuel comes to anoint the successor to the king Saul. He doesn't know who he's going to see, he just knows he needs to go see somebody. Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel, but Samuel said to him, "The Lord has not chosen these." So he asked Jesse, "Are these all the sons you have?" "There is still the youngest," Jesse answered. "He is tending the sheep." Samuel said, "Send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives." Now, at the moment when Samuel showed up asking who belonged in Jesse's house, or in other words, who mattered to Jesse, David was quite literally left out in the cold. Now, I want to connect this biblical narrative to where it fits with the prophetic words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In a 1967 speech, he addressed the state of American race relations thusly. I'm going to read it exactly so I don't mess it up, because he is one of my heroes. He says, "Let me start out by talking about racism, and more we've got to tell the truth to America about this problem. And the truth means saying to our nation that the roots of racism are very deep in America, and they're still here. And that racial injustice is still the black man's burden and the white man's shame. Now, admittedly, we've made some strides. We've made some progress. But this shouldn't cause any of us to become apathetic or lax or complacent. No one denies that the plant of freedom has grown only a bud and not yet a flower. The problems that we face are still very serious. On the Statue of Liberty, we read that America is the mother of exiles. But it doesn't take us long to realize that America has been the mother of its white exiles from Europe. She has not evinced the same maternal care and concern for her black exiles who were brought to this country in chains from Africa. And it is no wonder that our slave foreparents could think about it and they could start singing in a beautiful soul song and a beautiful sorrowful song, "Sometimes I feel like a motherless child." So like David from the biblical narrative, Dr. King was saying, and black people continue to cry out in myriad ways, In case you forgot, I'm part of this household. In case you forgot, I belong. In case you forgot, I matter. Now, let me pause for station identification to say two important things about tonight. One, actually, there's three. I'm sorry, I got my little arithmetic off. One, I'm going to talk for a brief period because I feel like what's more germane, what's more important, and what's more valuable is for us to have back and forth discussion. I could stand up here and lecture you for a half hour or even longer if I needed to. I got a big mouth. And I got it honest, because if you know my mother, you know I got it perfectly honest. But I give talks like this fairly frequently, and one of the things that I discovered is that people take away more when they are a part of an active, engaged part of the discussion. So I prefer to have brief remarks and then take it to the part where you ask me questions, I ask you questions, and we toss the ball around, so to speak. All right? Mm-hmm. Number two, regardless of how uncomfortable you are with the discussion of race, you have to stick and stay. It's important and it's necessary. So in the tradition of preachers everywhere, turn to your neighbor and say, it's necessary. It's necessary. Okay. Now, I was recently told by a well-meaning white friend on Facebook something that it really struck me, and I had to sit down. It took me several days to really turn it over in my head and understand the full meaning of what he was trying to say. And I want to read it in your hearing, and I'm going to read it because I don't want to mess it up. He said, hate needs to be exposed to the searing light of day, but not everyone needs to read it. Some people's hearts are too wide open and feel an instinct to protect themselves from hate, just as we might instinctively seek to protect our children. And I said, okay. But then when I thought about it some more, I went past being angry. I got mad, which is a whole nother level of emotion. And I said, why are you getting so angry about this? He meant well, and I understand what he was driving at. But then the realization of what he was trying to posit stuck in my head, and I wrote him back. And I don't think we've spoken on Facebook since, but whatever. I said, I feel bad for them, their tender sensibilities and their childlike need for protection. I guess it's up to people like me to deal with hate because we can't escape it, while they sit on the sidelines cloistered from the things that don't affect them directly. So it's important that regardless of where you think you are with regard to race relations, be you black or white or anything else that's represented in this room, you have a responsibility to yourself as a part of the we the people I was talking about earlier, and as a child of the Most High God that I was talking about earlier. He puts on all of us a responsibility for ministry. You may not be appointed, you may not wear a collar, you may not stand in front of a congregation or do any of the things that you generally tend to think of as ministry, but you have a life responsibility as ministers of the gospel. People will see more gospel in how you live than most of the times they will ever see by setting foot in the doors of a church. Because most people, as we know in the United States, fewer and fewer people do in fact attend church on a regular basis. So at your job, at your school, where you go to do whatever you do socially, those are the moments when you present God through who you are and through how you are to the people around you. And so I'm going to say some more about that later, but let me move on to point number two. See how close I am to a preacher? I could take point one and make it. Boy, I'm telling you, I might be down for this whole ministry thing. So, number two, I want to say something else. I do not want us to get sidetracked or bogged down tonight anyway with a discussion about the current occupant of the White House. We know who he is. If you're a reading literate thinking individual. You probably have your set of opinions about him and his administration, but I would prefer that regardless of how badly you need to get it off your chest, take it to the Lord in prayer. Go down to the creek and holler it to the bullfrogs if you need to. But we're going to bypass that tonight, because the problems that we need to talk about and the problems we need to work through did not begin on November 9th, 2016. They do not find their genesis on January 20th, 2017. I want to talk about some things that find their genesis in 1619, in 1776, in 1789. And if you are a student of history like me, I'm sure you know where I'm going with these dates. If you have any questions, you can see me afterwards. 1790, First Naturalization Act in the United States. 1850, Fugitive Slave Act. 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson. 1934, Federal Housing Act. So there are a number of waypoints and points of anchoring that put us where we are here in 2018. So we'll leave off with the stuff about the current occupant of the White House. You notice I didn't say his name, right? So I'd like us to discuss two issues that speak to those things and relate to the ideas presented here in today's lesson, Black Lives Matter. Now, a little bit about that before I get into the meat of my talk. I'll just give you a little bit of history about how this book came to be. Some of you weren't here when I talked in February, so we'll just quickly go through it. Now, I have two children, twin boys who are now 12 years old. Several years ago, when the older of the two of them, who's like an hour older than the other one, that's a long story in itself, I won't bore you with it, but he was in the 4th grade, and I picked him and his brother up from school. We're in the car, and as we normally do, we're sitting there talking about how was your day, and how was your day, and what happened, and what was interesting, and what was different, and what surprised you about the things that happened to you today. These are the kinds of things we do, and it's the kind of questions I ask because as a journalist, I'm nosy. So I ask my boys all kinds of things like this, and it forces them to really delve into their thinking on things, their feelings, their reactions, and how they encapsulate what has transpired in their lives. We all should be able to do that. So we're in the car, we're talking, and I say, so Aaron, what happened to you today? And he starts telling me this story about Michael Brown, the young man who was killed in Ferguson, Missouri. But it seemed to me like his version of events was focusing off of and reflecting back from a funhouse mirror. And you know what a funhouse mirror does to something. It distorts it and makes it really weird. It's nothing like the original. And so I'm driving and I feel like I want to pull the car over, but okay, let's get home. One of the things that comes out in this conversation is that he is operating under the impression that Michael Brown deserved what he got. I'm like, where are you getting this from? Well, my teacher said. His teacher, to a group of 8- and 9-year-old black and brown children, stood up in the front of the room and said, Michael Brown deserved what he got because he attacked a police officer. Now, my boys don't necessarily know, but I know immediately from my understanding of our system of jurisprudence as it is theoretically, that even if he were to have beaten down that police officer, that would be charged as assault and battery or perhaps aggravated assault. And if he were arrested, charged, indicted, gone to trial, convicted, and sentenced, he probably would have served at a maximum maybe 5, even 10 years. And he would have gotten out and would have gone on with his life. And that's the key word. He would have gone on with his life. So I had to explain to my son that This man was tried and convicted and sentenced right there on the street top. And he was sentenced to life, or should we say death. And so I said, well, that was the number one problem. Even if this man had done something so terrible as to require having been imprisoned, he would likely have survived that part of his life and had an opportunity to do better or do different on the other side of that moment. But he never got that opportunity. So I said, just to make sure I'm not hearing you improperly, tell me more about what your teacher said, son. And he goes on and tells me about this conversation, how it started and all these other things. And I am livid. It's all I can do in that moment, because I'm seeing red, to get us home so that we can further this discussion. I can make dinner and we can do all the things that need to be done. They can do homework and I can get myself together. It was very fortunate that at the point we had this conversation, it was probably 5:30. And I knew that the staff and administration at the school were gone for the day. But being who I am, a writer, I got up early the next morning and I wrote a sternly worded note to the principal with the understanding that we need to meet today. Not tomorrow, not when it's convenient for your calendar. We need to meet today, because if I don't have some clear understanding about this and we don't have some real serious straight talk, one of the people I respect the most in life has this saying. He says, straight talk makes for straight understanding. And I believe that. So I said, we need to have some straight talk and some straight understanding today, because otherwise we'll be having it in front of the district superintendent, and I'll be having it in my capacity as a journalist on the front page of the local newspaper. So clearly within about half hour of me having sent that note, I got a note back from the principal and from the teacher himself. And the teacher began to tell me several different versions of what happened. And as I began to correct him about the differences between those versions as they went along and the version that my son told me, we began to have this heated conversation. I said, listen, at the end of the day, you're in that room and I'm not there. You're responsible for a group of people who you have to teach and prepare for the world. However, they are not equipped with the understanding of history and culture that I have, because I'm much older and I have gone through this. And number two, your statement that my son misunderstood what it was that you were trying to say, I do not take that to be true. I said, my son is not the best student in the world, but my son understands people. He is very attentive to how people feel and how they think. And so I don't take that as true, what you're saying about he misrepresenting what it is you have to say. So we go back and forth, and finally I'm like, listen, I've got other things to do, but I need you to know the next time we have to have a conversation similar to this, we'll be having it in a very public forum. And you'll be asked to show cause for why it is you feel as though you need to inculcate your worldview, as limited as it is, on these people who have, number one, I send my sons to school with a contract. It's unspoken, it's unwritten, but it's a contract nonetheless. I expect them to go to school, listen to what the teachers are telling them, and I expect them to accept what it is that they're hearing pretty much as the truth. So if you go to a place and you're prepared to accept what it is you're hearing as truth, when you have a teacher step outside of their real contracted role to give you the things that we understand as really truth and start to tell you some things that are part of what it is they're bringing in from the outside that won't benefit you or support you or view you as somebody who matters, it's difficult, especially at that early age and stage, to know what is meat and what is bone. They don't know what bone to throw away. And so we had this back and forth, and then I realized how many parents have the kinds of conversations with their children that I have with my sons pretty much every day? How many parents are in a situation where English is a second language to them? How many parents, because they work 2 jobs and they are struggling with everything they know just to keep their eyes open so they can make it from one job to the next and figure out how they're going to keep food on the table, they don't have time nor the energy to delve into these things and certainly craft a response that meets the need of the situation. So I said, okay, you know what? I'm responsible, and this is that calling that I was talking about earlier. This calling to be, in a sense, a prophet, to say the things to America that needs to be said and address the problems head on. And so I began working on this basically as an essay, and it took on a life of its own. As I said, I got a lot to say usually. And so it turned into this book. It's not big, but I feel like it addresses several things in some important ways. So you're free to ask me about that in the moment when time is available. Now, of late, there's been a rash of instances where Black people have been harshly reminded that our belonging is situational and our standing is provisional. Now, I can personally attest to the fact that if you're Black, regardless of how much you've accumulated in your bank account, no matter how many degrees you can hang on your wall, no matter how extensive your vocabulary is, and I love words, I'm a lover of all these things. I play around with words all day. That's what I do for a living. I'm a magazine writer and editor. And so that's my love, and my friends laugh at me. They were like, how is it that you get out of college and you take a job where you got to write a paper every week? Because I'm crazy. You know that. You've been knowing me for a long time. So what's important is, regardless of those things, your melanin remains a marker, an indelible indicator of where you are to be placed in this society, in this invisible but as yet unbroken classification system. That's one of the features of what I like to call American apartheid. Most people don't like to call it that because it's not nice, it's not seemly, but it's so true. So these instances are at their base about demonstrating the consequences of knowing your place. Now, think about that phrase, knowing your place. That's a phrase out of the history of the United States, especially in the South. You got to know your place. I'm gonna be nice tonight. N-word. Know your place. I did not say you could do that, or be there, or be with that person, or have that as a set of rights that you think you can feel comfortable with. This is a timely moment for me to be here, especially in the aftermath of what happened at the Starbucks in Philadelphia the other week. That right there was example par excellence of Black men not knowing their place. And so I want to talk to you, and I'll close the loop in a second and bring this back to the discussion in the book. I want to talk to you about white spaces, white tears, and white power. Now, white spaces, let me give you a quick and dirty definition of what that is. Anytime you're in a place where the majority of the people in that space and the people who control that space and the people who set the rules for that space are white in America, that's considered a white space. Now, even though we have reached a point in 2018 where there has been a great deal of somewhat change, we'll say illusory change in America, you're not going to find a whites only sign outside of a Starbucks. You're not going to find a colored water fountain inside or outside of a Starbucks or any place like that. or on a golf course, like these women were accosted on a golf course by the police the other day because the owner called the police on them because apparently they were golfing while black or golfing too slow while black, whatever. The point is that that was a white space. Traditionally, golf courses, you don't think about black people when you think about golf. When you think about those lovely green lawns and those sloping hills and the bunkers and all of these things, you think about a country club setting that is the province of white people. And so, Tiger Woods notwithstanding, it still is the case even today. Now, if I enter a white space, what is the instant reaction to that? People are put on alert. Who is this person? Why are they here? What is their business here? And generally what happens is you get the most polite and friendly question you ever want to hear. May I help you? And baked into that may I help you is, what in the world or what in the hell are you doing here? Who told you you could darken this door? Literally darken this door. And the white space has its rules, whether they're written down, whether they're well understood or not, whether they are in flux, but it has its rules. And part of the rule system is that in order to be a full and not a provisional member, you have to be of a certain phenotype. You have to be, for lack of a better word, Caucasian. And so the white space has its openness today, but at the same time, it still has a closed roster of full membership because you don't belong and you're not in your place. Now, the funny thing is, I always find this hilarious. The manager of the Starbucks who called the police on those gentlemen was working at a job, and I believe all work is valuable and all work has dignity. But we do recognize that all work pays different. All work has a certain status in our system along with everything else. Now here you are working an hourly job, working your way up to the possibility of having a salaried position. And so you are at a certain place economically and sociologically in our system because we value people by what they do, believe it or not. When you meet somebody new, probably within the first 10 minutes of you talking to them, what is the one question that's going to come up? What do you do for a living? Because we inculcate, we put together who you are and what you do to earn money. That becomes who you are. And so this person who is working an hourly job at a coffee house trying to make ends meet uses another built-in status, her whiteness, to deal with her cognitive dissonance around the response of these black men to her stated request about why they're there, why they are not in their place. I know you're not in your place because you're in this place, and this is definitely not your place. This is a white space. The other people who were caught on video saying that, listen, I didn't buy anything before I used the bathroom. I've been sitting here minding my business, doing my thing, and nobody asked me a thing about why I was here. Because again, they have title and deed to full membership in this space. So nobody would ask for station identification, right? So at that moment when she could not get them to see that, listen, I'm a member in good standing, and I'm telling you, you cannot be here, and you need to respect my authority. She then went to the next step of it, what I like to call white tears. Not to say that she stood there and cried. White tears, generally speaking, we've come to define it as a white person understanding that them delving into their feelings and their sense of an affront to what I like to call Jim Crow etiquette. And you'll see me, if you read the book, you know I referred to that in using the characters. Jim Crow etiquette basically is an understanding that black people and white people have roles to play, and if you as a black person do not live up to your role, you are in violation of Jim Crow etiquette. It may be 2018, but there's still some understood ways that you as a black person should respond to me, a duly minted white person. You see it on the street all the time. Usually it happens in cases where somebody is wearing a blue uniform and a metal badge. And they have a belt on their waist, and it carries maybe a taser, maybe some silver bracelets. They go nice with certain outfits, and a gun. And I am not only a member of this group, but I'm a member of this group, which is part of the power structure that can turn white tears into white power. And that's what I mean. I don't mean skinheads. I don't mean people with swastikas. When I say white power in this particular instance, I mean the use of institutional strength and authority to right a perceived wrong. In most cases, with the people in the blue uniforms, it's crime, but there was no crime at the Starbucks the other week. Can we agree on that much? Yes. There was no crime. But institutional authority and strength was brought to bear in response to white tears. This woman called the police. There are men here, and they won't leave, and I need you to come. Click. And so they show up and stupidly just say, I came to arrest somebody, and somebody's getting arrested. These bracelets are not here for my health. And so they cart these men away after they haven't done a thing. And in watching the video, and I watched it several times, they reminded me of Jesus. That's right. They understood something about America that Jesus understood about Roman authority and understood about his place in the hierarchy with Roman authority at the top, which is why in the spirituals we sing, Jesus never said a mumbling word. They understood, I better not say a mumbling word, or I might end up like Philando Castile. I might end up like Tamir Rice. I might end up like the hundreds and hundreds of black men and women in this country in the past, even 5 years, who ended up in a grave early because they decided that they did not know their place, or they would not accept their place. One of the things that I toss around in my head all the time is, and some of you are educators, so you understand very clearly what it is I'm talking about. Two researchers named Kubler and Ross came up with an idea that there are 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. The problem with America vis-a-vis black people is that black people have never been allowed to grieve. Why? America will accept a lot from black people, but they will not accept black anger. Black people can be in denial. You can deny what's happening around you all you want. That's fine. You can bargain, but you're not bargaining from a position of strength, so bargain all you want, because we still hold the keys to everything that you need in life. Depression, you can be depressed. I've suffered from depression myself. I tell people, I grew up in Brooklyn, went to college in Nashville, and ended up on a campus that was almost completely, literally, lily white. And I learned some things. I started off in college being accosted and harassed by the campus police. And just like a college athlete, I moved back to New York and I went pro. I went from being harassed by the campus police to the New York City police. So in a sense, I went pro. Mom, I got drafted. I'm in the first round. And there's a sense in which my depression around that, about the fact that I can't go anywhere without being followed in the store or followed on the street or asked about where I'm coming from or where I'm going, as though in the 1990s, the 2000s, and the 2010s, I have to have a pass to go from one plantation to the next.
Oh, God.
When I get stopped in my car and I'm asked a whole bunch of irrelevant and unimportant questions because they want to see my attitude. They want to look at me and judge what type of Negro I am. There is a justified anger that should bubble up. But I know that, like these young men at Starbucks, I better not say a mumbling word, because I recognize where I am in that moment. I need to live to get home to raise my sons. So rather than give what the natural response could and should be, I gotta push it down. Because I understand I'm in the context of white power. Now, let's turn this back to the schools, which is the context in which this book is set. Something hit me like a ton of bricks about a month and a half ago, and it shook me in a way that few things rarely shake me. Few things shake me. I thought about the day-to-day atmosphere in a school in terms of what it actually is, and what hit me was that regardless of where you are in a school, you could be in the middle of the hood. And I grew up in New York City. I grew up in Brooklyn, and I went to schools that were predominantly black and Latino. Because whether you know it or not, America is still segregated. It's as segregated today as it was when Dr. King died 50 years ago. And we know that our school systems are set up based on where you live. So if you live in a segregated society in terms of housing, you live in a segregated society in terms of education. The two go hand in hand, and not incidentally. They go hand in hand intentionally. It was part of a plan. Don't let anybody ever tell you different. It was intentional. If you want to know more about that, I've written an essay about it. I think it's fantastic. You ought to read it. So, one of the things that is amazing to me is that if you are in the hood and you are a student at a school that is overwhelmingly black, it could be 95% black, it's still a white space. Why? 80% of teachers in the United States are white. So more than likely, regardless of where you live, you could live in Brooklyn, you could live in Southeast Queens, you could live in Oakland, California, you could live in Southeast Texas, you could live in Chicago, you could live in Miami. But if you are going to public schools in the United States, more than likely you stand a good chance of going from kindergarten to 12th grade having had 0 black teachers. So all of your formal education comes from people who do not look like you, do not share certain cultural touchstones, and have a different point of view on a lot of things. Not to say that they're bad people. I'm sure a lot of them are awesome people. You will not do something for that little bit of money and spend the hours that you end up spending and pull money out of your own pocket in order to round out the educational experience if you were not, to a large measure, a good person. But even good people can be racist. I love it the other day. Somebody sent out a tweet in response to Barbara Bush's passing this past week. And the person said that Barbara Bush was a, what did they say? She was a lovely, strong, and kind racist who, along with her husband, raised a war criminal. I said, wow, that was tight. Oh, ouch. But there was a certain truth in there. And I talk about, and when I talk to people about myth making, And right now we're in the process of a little bit of myth making about Barbara Bush, the same way we are constantly in the process of myth making about the United States. I do a radio show on the weekends. I'm a panelist on a show that comes on every Sunday. And this past week, during a segment that I did, I talked about the myth of George Washington, how, we talk about him as a freedom-loving patriot. He's the father of our country, he loves freedom, freedom. But we don't hear about Ona Judge. Who's Ona Judge? Her story is entangled with George Washington. She was an enslaved black woman who was raised on the Mount Vernon plantation in Virginia that George Washington owned. When he became president, she was the mistress to Martha Washington. So when they moved to Philadelphia during his presidency, Ona Judge went with them to Philadelphia. Now, the thing about Pennsylvania was that you could not stay in Pennsylvania more than 6 months, or your slaves would be automatically manumitted, which means they would be freed by decree of the laws of the state of Pennsylvania. So what did George Washington do? He shuttled slaves back and forth between Pennsylvania and Virginia so that they would never reach the curing stage of 6 months and be manumitted, because he had no intention of setting his slaves free. We the people who are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. He had no intention of doing that. Now, Ona Judge, with help from some other people in Philadelphia, escaped and fled to Vermont. And she lived out the rest of her life in Vermont as a free black woman. Now, for the rest of his life, George Washington never stopped using his means as a wealthy white man to try to bring back this person who he considered his property. Even during his presidency, George Washington was in hot pursuit of Ona Judge. And so those histories go together. So the myth that you hear about freedom-loving George Washington, the more you know about history, the more you know about the fact that that is some myth-making. Right? Mm-hmm. So I want to ask you some questions, and we can bat that around. In a quote-unquote black school, in a black neighborhood, do you agree with me that these are undeclared white spaces? Think about this. Who sets the rules there? Who sets the standards of appearance that affect who gets validated and who does not? We just heard stories about some black girls at a school, a publicly funded charter school, where they were continually suspended and written up and put on detention because of the hair that grows out of their scalp. Now, if you can be persona non grata because of the hair that grows out of your scalp, that means that you as a person is by definition persona non grata. Because the rules of this space, this white space, say that you do not belong just because of what's encoded in your DNA. Who sets the narrative about who is good, heroic, smart, inventive, versus who is evil, worthless, and inferior? Check your textbooks. Who determines who is a hulking thug or a playful scamp? Now, I have a bit of history with this. When I was growing up, my mother used to keep foster children. And I was in high school, I guess I was about 16 or 17, about to go off into big, bold world on my own. But I had a younger brother, a foster brother, who, because of his life situation, the things that he experienced, had some real issues. But he was 5 years old. Anybody in this room who's around 5-year-olds know that 5-year-olds generally come roughly around this size. Somewhere in here. I get a call one day asking me to go up to that school to go and pick up this kindergartner from school because he's in trouble. I'm like, what trouble could a 5-year-old got into the school? So I show up at the school, and this classroom looked as though Hurricane Katrina had gone through. And I'm looking at him, I was like, did you do this? He's standing there like, And I turned to the teacher, you allowed him to do this? And she's like, and as I begin to ask her, how is it that you could let somebody that small tear up your room like this? I understand you got rules about engagement, how you can touch kids and this, that, and the third, but I cannot imagine being in a position where I would let a little boy do this to my room and do this to me. But again, when the referral came out after the fact, oh, you should have heard the language about the relative strength, the Herculean way in which he did this, that, and the third. And I was like, okay, so what we're missing in this description is the fact that we still have a 5-year-old boy. Skinny is all get out. He's super skinny. Nothing hulking, nothing threatening, nothing thuggish about him. Just angry for reasons that he himself cannot find the words for. He can't articulate his rage because of the hand that life has already dealt him at age 5. And so he takes it out on snack time. Whose discretion determines when a particular offense is to be laughed off or referred to the principal or the police? It's important to me that we understand, especially in the weeks following the death of Linda Brown, whose name will forever be synonymous with the 1954 Supreme Court decision, Brown versus the Board of Education. That case supposedly tore down the Plessy versus Ferguson doctrine, the 1896 I referred to earlier, of separate but equal. But what I've come to find is that in the years since that 1954 decision, America pivoted and did not go from separate but equal to together and equal. They went to not separate but not equal. When you hear about schools where students are tracked, and generally speaking, the darker you are, the more definitely negative your tracking is going to be. You're going to be tracked into special ed. They're going to try as much as they can to diagnose you with attention deficit disorder so that they can medicate you and warehouse you, and at the end of the thing, spit you out the other side. If you make it to the other side, and we'll get back to that if in a second. Within a school, even if you go to a school that has some black and some white children, what happens? You have gifted and talented programs where certain children are identified as gifted and therefore they're separated. They're a cut above the rest of the student population. And generally speaking, who do those children tend to be more than not? White children. You always will have a talented tenth, as W.E.B. Du Bois said. So you'll have a few black children who manage to, despite the odds, make it into those gifted and talented programs. Sometimes you even have gifted and talented schools. How do I know? I attended one. I attended a school in New York City where you had to take a competitive examination to get in. And this year, now when I was there, the black student population at school was roughly about 8%. This past year, 3 black people were admitted to that school's upcoming freshman class. That school has about 2,500 students. So in this upcoming class, which will probably be about 800-900 people, 3 black people. In a whole New York City, only 3 black people had the wherewithal to take that competitive examination and do well enough to secure for themselves a seat in the class at that competitive science and math high school. Now, the funny thing is, and this is how white spaces and white power are managed in a situation like that. There has been a big hue and cry over the need to change the entrance criteria. There's like 8 of these schools in the city. And I just happen to go to the best one. But there are 8 of these schools in the city. and you take a competitive exam to get in, and they sort you out based on your score and where you rank in that. I like that. It's egalitarian. That's great. It's wonderful. Now, the hue and cry is over the fact they feel like the test is not fair to Black and Latino students because there are not enough of them going in. But I feel, and I feel like I'm justified in feeling, that the hue and cry from the powers that be in the city are not over Black and Latino kids. The tears that they're shedding for white children. Why? Because here's how the game goes. Bronx High School of Science, which is another one of these competitive examination schools, which is in the South Bronx. If you know anything about South Bronx, it has a certain reputation and a well-deserved one at that, right? But Bronx High School of Science is a beacon in the middle of the hood. 63% of the students who attend Bronx High School of Science are Asian. More than 50% of the students who attend Stuyvesant High School, which is the high school I attended, are Asian. So the hue and cry, although unspoken, is a concern and an anger over the fact that the Asians don't know their place. The Asians are taking over a set of schools that were designed intentionally to freely educate the children of white people in New York City. One of my great friends at work, I consider him to be a mentor. He is an actual historian. He attended Brooklyn Technical High School, which is another one of these 8 schools. He attended back in the 50s, and he also attended City College of New York back when it was free, but that's another story. He tells me about how, in his day, all of those schools were lily white, and most of them did not accept women. Only, I guess, in the 60s did they start accepting women at these schools, but the women who came were white women. That was just understood. Now, if you cause a stink and you make the world know that it's unfair to Black people and Latino people that they can't get a fair shake in terms of getting into Stuyvesant or Brooklyn Tech or Bronx Science, then perhaps you can get people to start playing their violin and really go ahead and change the rules. But what are the rules being changed for? Certainly not for people who look like me, because if you cared about people who look like me getting into Stuyvesant or Brooklyn Tech or Bronx Science, you would improve the junior high schools in our neighborhoods. You would improve the elementary schools in our neighborhoods. So therefore, when it came time at the end of the 8th grade to take this competitive examination, you would have a larger pool of people from those neighborhoods who were prepared to sit down, take that test, and do well enough to secure for themselves a place in the freshman classes of these schools, right? Mm-hmm. But they're not prepared to do that. What they're doing is saying, you know what, we're going to use the Black and Latino kids as our Trojan horse to allow us to get in here and change up the thing so that we now have the power to change these white spaces back into what we initially intended them to be, which are majority white spaces. And so if you change up the rules and eliminate the test, somebody in an office somewhere where you do not see and will never know makes these decisions. And that brings me to what it is I ask of you all. And we can get into the discussion part in just a second. In an interview that appeared in the New York Times, Joe Fagan, a white sociologist at Texas A&M, who has studied race in America for the past 40 years, said that the appearance that racism has been in decline is a fiction. Mm-hmm. He says, and I quote, "The appearance of major change in white racist framing is created by the fact that many whites have learned to suppress a front stage expression of some or much of their overtly racist framing, such as in public settings where there are people present who are unknown to them. However, data such as that noted previously for white college students reveal that a great many whites still assert and perform a blatantly racist framing of people in color in backstage settings. So in that office where they're going to decide who is going to attend these schools and who is going to be seated where, there's nobody looking on. There's not a public performance, so I can do what I want now. So when Uncle Bob is sitting around the dinner table at Thanksgiving, waxing poetic about how things were in his day, we never had these problems because people knew their place, it's up to you. I'm not there. Bob's not inviting me over for Thanksgiving dinner. My name is not Sidney Poitier, but that's nothing. When the head of your department at work tosses resumes from people with certain names that sound a certain way, or people whose names might sound like John Smith, but you see a few lines below that they attended a historically black college or university, it's up to you. When you see someone preparing to use the police to avenge a violation of Jim Crow etiquette, I applaud the people at Starbucks for standing up. It didn't really change anything. Those two guys still got some matching bracelets to go with their outfits, but at least they weren't afraid to stand up and make clear that they understood what was happening and that they were disgusted by it as much as I would be. When you witness your friend policing what black people say about our experiences and our pain. Now, I'm a lover of Facebook, and I love to go on Facebook and watch how people will go into someone's status and begin to, what they say, white-splain racism, white-splain slavery, white-splain this, that, or third. And I will usually give them a nice little dose of history and say, take that with you. And you can almost hear the cognitive dissonance melting them like the Wicked Witch at the end of, it's like, I'm melting. And that anger, them being in their feelings, is the part that bothers me, because that's what racism really is based on. It's not a set of facts that you go to. What do you appeal to? Feelings. I feel as though. And in the time we're in now in 2018, I feel as though has taken a place where it is on the same level as I can objectively prove that. So I feel as though has been promoted to the level of I can objectively prove that, or I can show through historical evidence that. The problem with these things, these examples I gave about Uncle Bob and your supervisor and your friend who is policing people on the internet, they require, and there's an expectation of secrecy. Shh, this bit of racism is just between us. Don't tell anybody. So, as I said, I address a lot of groups. I recently addressed a group of college students, and I'll be finished after this point. I told them that whether they're black or white, racism has been in the air they've breathed since their birth. You cannot avoid it. I don't care what you tell yourself, there are a set of racist, white supremacist understandings that permeate the air. What differentiates you from the virulent racist or the well-meaning stupid racist is the fact that you take the time to actually think and go beyond your I feel that's and begin to deal with your I can objectively prove that's. And that's what separates you. So I need you now to, I can objectively prove that with me. Can we do that? Let's talk about the questions I asked. How you use your power as a white person, how you deal with the world in which you have a certain status and therefore can say certain things and do certain things that I unfortunately cannot because of the beautiful caramel colored skin that I was gifted by my mother. What are we going to do? Let's talk about these questions. Let's go back and talk about the white spaces in schools. Or if you have any other questions or any things you want to say or comments you want to make about what I said, I open up to you and I am willing to answer as best I can.
It just occurred to me to reflect that one reason the church remains so totally segregated on Sunday morning is that I go to church in a white space.
Right.
And it's new language for me to own that way, but there are all kinds of consequences of that.
Right.
Which is, in fact, the first time I had a black member in the parish I was right there in Fredericksburg, her name, ironically, was Alda White. I had lunch with her, and I said, what's it like? She said, you know, I can't deal with this. Even though you have welcomed me, I get the look from a lot of people. And I don't get the look from some people, but I get the look from anybody that's a white space.
Yep. And it's funny, you know how I talked about the intersection between the stories of George Washington and Ona Judge? How you can't really pull those stories apart?
I've got the book.
The history of the white church in America and the history of the black church in America are linked up in that way. The black church in America broke off, in a sense, ran away and freed itself from the white church in America. If you know the history of the AME Zion Church and the AME Church in the United States, these were black people who attended worship with their white slave masters and later on with other free white people. And because of the racism under the steeple, not out in the street, not at work, racism under the steeple, they decided that they had to break away from this white space and have a space where they could worship their God in a way where they weren't demeaned. So, exactly, white space. Anybody else? Okay, so let me go back to my questions. In U.S. schools, now we'll go back to Marcus Garvey Carter, and I named him that intentionally, in case you're wondering, and his brother, Malcolm Xavier or Malcolm X Carter. They're in a white space. He's a brilliant boy, 10th grader, is in honors chemistry, has never had a single disciplinary incident during his scholastic career. But he finds himself on one day on the verge of being tossed into and onto the conveyor belt of the school to prison pipeline. It's structural. It's not happenstance, it's structural. I say this to people all the time. There are two forces at work that are happening right now. You may think I'm a conspiracy theorist, but prove to me that I am not crazy, that I'm crazy. Prove to me that I'm crazy. One, the school to prison pipeline is part of an effort to deliver black bodies to the prison industrial complex. When you are in a growth industry, you all the time need more fodder. You need more raw material. And if you're going to grow prisons in the United States, you need more bodies. And if your program is to fill your prisons with black bodies, you need to open new frontiers in where you acquire your raw material. And the new and overwhelmingly attractive place to find that raw material is public schools. If you create a white space and therefore you set the rules of engagement, you determine who is a good boy and who's bad. You can determine for any particular type of offense, any type of event, who will be judged harshly for that thing or who will be let off, like I said, who will be considered a thug or who will be considered a playful scamp. So that's one of the forces going. The second one, and I believe this is true, is that what we're seeing is a move to eliminate universal compulsory schooling in the United States. The end game is to eliminate public education in the United States. Why? For the same reason I believe that the safety net programs and the other Great Society programs are being attacked. Because if you do not want that person to get those benefits, instead of coming out and say, I don't like you, I hate you, I'm a racist, and I don't want you to get that benefit, let's just bankrupt the Treasury. That way I can look you in your face and say, hey, I would give it to you, but we can't afford it. Yes. Why do you think our schools are underfunded? We're at a place now where we've reached a level of frustration with public schools that we are willing to give public dollars to private corporations to educate children in this country. That's what charter schools are.
Yes.
They're the product of our frustration with public schooling because it has been intentionally underfunded. Why do you think teachers are walking out in Arizona right now? Because they're underpaid, underappreciated, and the product shows in the level of education that children receive. When you are stressed out and having to work 3, 4 jobs, and you are putatively a professional, I always talk about the deprofessionalization of the teaching profession with programs like Teach for America. You mean to tell me that people go to school for 4 years to learn how to do this, turn around and go for 2 more years to get a master's to really master how to do this? Some people go and get doctorates, EDDs and PhDs to learn how to manage classrooms and give our children the education they deserve. And you can't in 5 weeks learn how to do that? Who are you kidding? Yeah, you've got a degree in something else. I feel like I'm schooled enough in history and a lot of things to probably stand up in front of a class. I've taught SAT prep, but I know without having to be told that I'm not prepared to adequately educate children because I don't have the training. But if you can lower the understanding of what teachers are and what they contribute, then you can pay them less. You can put them in environments where the buildings are crumbling around them, like in Baltimore. This winter, you had students and teachers learning in environments where it was 30 degrees outside and it's 30 degrees inside. If you, and here's the end game. If you can eliminate public education in America, what does that allow you to do? Number one, it allows you to go back to the 19th century America, where most people, unless you had a lot of money, brought their children along with them to the factory because there was no child labor laws. So your children got up and went to work with you every day, or got up and did something to help bring money into the family, whether they went out in the street and shined shoes or sold oranges or whatever they did not go to school. And so if you eliminate school, because if you turn the public coffers over to private enterprise to teach your kids, eventually what will they do? They will be a profit-making enterprise, like she said, will price it out of the reach of most people. So unless you are the child of somebody who has money, or you have a gift or a talent in singing or music or art, or you're athletically gifted where you can get a scholarship, you will not go to school. And so what will happen? You will have an America where instead of them having to ship jobs over to Asia or to other places so they can have cheap labor, their cheap labor force will be right here because you won't have the wherewithal to collectively bargain. You won't have the wherewithal to demand a 5-day work week, an 8-hour work day, a lunch period, workman's comp, vacation time, health insurance. At my job, I get health insurance, life insurance, all other kinds of stuff. I'm just like, wow, when I compare that to what people make, what people get, which is hardly nothing, working at places like, say, Walmart or your local convenience store. And so the problem that I'm seeing is that the people who are behind these forces use the apathy of white people in general to the needs of people of color as a way of shutting them down to these processes that are happening right around them. And when they look up good and notice that these things have affected them and their posterity too, the agreement that they've ordained and established in the preamble is gone while they were busy looking, hey, that ain't got nothing to do with me. Yes, sir.
Okay, you know, without getting into the current administration and the Secretary of Education.
I appreciate you. Now, you can talk about the Secretary of Education all you want.
Because that is one of the things where she looks like she's going. But my question to you is, are you saying this is conscious or is this a subconscious?
It's conscious. Think about the woman you just brought up. Betsy DeVos. I like to call her Cabinet Secretary Barbie. She rolled up it.
Her name? Come on. Be better than that.
I'm a horrible person. I'm going to hell. What can I tell you? She is somebody who is a driver of the very process I was just talking to you about. In the state of Michigan, and I'll get right to you. In the state of Michigan, she is the poster child for the process of taking public funds and turning them over to private enterprise and allow them to becoming profit-making institutions. Whether you learn or not, and studies are coming out more and more that show that charter schools do no better in terms of student performance than your standard public school. And in some cases, they do provably worse. But what did I tell you about American myth making? The myth is that charter schools are an improvement over standard public schools. So let's go with charter schools until we figure out that we've been sold a bill of goods.
My comment about, now this is the head of education, and her quote was 60 minutes.
I understand that she's not the person we really want in that job.
Right.
That's like the understatement of like.
But to put a label on as he did was like.
Okay, so I'll tell you.
This is a waste of 30 minutes.
Let me address your comment, and I'll address your comment thus wise. Her being in that position is an insult to the 350 million people who reside in this country.
Yes,
it is.
She is not qualified in any way you would objectively say that somebody's qualified with that. Let me finish. I'm responding to what you said. She is not qualified. Why is she in that position? She bought her way in with two things. One, the money that she and her family have contributed to the Republican Party in general and to Donald Trump in particular. Number two, she bought her way in because of her belonging in the group. And so, as far as I'm concerned, she is just as qualified as Malibu Barbie to be there. And that's why I took that idea and said that she basically, now you could look at the whole rogues gallery of members of the president's cabinet. Most of them don't belong where they are. And I've got names for all of them. I got a name for Ben Carson that I will repeat in this room. And so you can be offended and upset, but that does not move me.
she shoved that in her hearing.
Exactly. She did not know the basic elements of the arguments and the things that they have been arguing in the field of education for the past 30 years. She had no clue.
She showed she didn't care.
Right, and she's never been to a school, a problem school.
Right.
No.
She never taught school. She never attended public school, did not send her children to public school, and is completely unaware of the issues facing public schools. All she cares about is siphoning public funds from public schooling and giving them to people like herself. That is her ultimate aim. She is a grifter, just like her boss, the grifter in chief.
But you're not going to talk about him.
I didn't mention his name just now, did I? Okay. I think I did say the T word at some point. I'm sorry. I apologize. I broke our compact. So the point is, I don't want you to get too upset about the label and really deal with what it is that I'm trying to get across with how she's comported herself. What she basically is saying, when you submit a budget from the Federal Department of Education that falls hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars short, knowing that most states are in hoc or nearly in hoc right now, and they cannot afford the unfunded mandates that they've already been given. So when you take those hundreds of million dollars off the table, the ultimate result is school systems that are poised to go under. And when they do, we will say, these public schools are worthless. Let's give our money to them. And that's part of the plan.
I appreciate your passion about education.
Right.
I believe in it myself. I love it.
Thank you.
And support and amen to what you're advocating. And how, instead of undoing the public schools, what can be done? What are some thoughts you have that can help the public schools be better than they are?
Well, I mean, people a lot smarter than me who get up every morning and think about these problems have some ideas. And I think in this setting, I would be hard pressed to give you, here, sir, here's your nugget that will turn this all around. Because there are several problems working together at the same time. One of them is that I mentioned is that our schools are funded using an outmoded system. It's intentionally left in place because of the effects that it generates, but it's outmoded. Your schools are funded based on where you live. The tax base in your area is what decides what funding your schools get. There's a certain amount that comes from the federal level, but a goodly portion of it comes from the local tax base. And if you live in an area that has been redlined historically, do I have to explain what redlining is to anybody? Okay, if you live in an area that has been redlined historically and is therefore bereft of business-making ventures and the types of loans that will allow businesses to be supported and created and to thrive and expand, that will also expand your local tax base, and you've been redlined so you don't have the type of home improvement and the type of growth in neighborhoods that will bring in a tax base from real estate tax, then your schools will invariably suck. And schools in the neighborhood right across the tracks, whose tax base is 3 or 4 times what yours is, will have AP classes. They will have the best and most well-trained teachers. They will have science labs. They will have facilities like nice gyms. They will have music programs. They will have art. They will have stuff that most people think is totally unimportant today, like science. Forget about AP classes that give you free college credit in high school because you cannot afford it. So that's one problem that could be changed to make schools across the country better. Because even though 80% of teachers are white, I don't believe necessarily that the problem lies at their feet exclusively. Right. You got some bad apples in that bunch. I know that to be true. My son had one. But I know there's plenty who are great people. Yes?
Okay. I just want to hear your thoughts on Parkland, Florida right now. And the reason why I want to hear your thoughts, that is an area where the amount of money that the parents have directly affects the level of education given to those children.
Right.
So they could stand and speak. Now, how many people see that as a threat when you have young people? Because I can remember I was affected by Brown versus the Board of Education. I went to integrated school when I was 7 years old. And I know that when you educate the black, the brown, the Asian, then those who come in contact with an educated individual who is a different color becomes more threatened. So it's not just the whites that go to Parkland.
Right.
It's also the African American students and everyone who's able to stand and speak because they were educated.
Right.
And then when you throw in the fact that during the slave days, that it was against the law to even teach a slave to read, because an educated person, no matter what color they are, becomes a scary person when you're trying to hold them back.
Exactly. Now, I will say this about the Parkland thing. She makes an incredible set of points. One of the things is this. I see the 1960s as the point at which the powers that be, whoever you want to say they are, decided that public education in the United States was a problem and it needed to be eliminated by any means necessary. Because black activists and white activists during the 60s showed America that the middle class had brilliant and strategic thinking people who could upset the apple cart of the oligarchs in this country. When you have protests about the Vietnam War, when you have protests over civil rights by blacks and whites, you create a situation where you have brilliant people like your Martin Luther King Jr.'s, your Stokely Carmichaels, people who were well-read, well-spoken, and were clear and incisive about what it is they wanted and what America owed to them. And they could say it in a way that broke through the built-up resistance of people who did not want to hear about America not being this perfect place, the perfect place, this land of plenty.
The implication you're saying is that right now we have a whole bunch of stupid people in our schools and in our work, I guess.
Well, think about it. The person who currently occupies the White House during a campaign
He is
stop.
not an example of anything.
Let me say something. The person who currently occupies the White House during a campaign stop said, and I quote, "I love the uneducated people." Why did he say that? Because the uneducated populace allows him, and he is a member of the oligarchy, he's a billionaire, it allows people like him to manipulate the system even more. And the people in the 60s who would have fought back, you had a groundswell, a number of people who understood because they were taught to think instead of now being taught what to think. So back then, people were taught how to think. Now we're taught what to think. And all the things that will go along with allowing you to fabricate your own opinion and make crucial, important decisions about the kind of America you want to live in, they come up short. And we are in a spiral downward in that regard. Now, with Parkland, she is absolutely right. You have children who are well educated, they know how to think, they know how to speak, they can advocate for themselves, they know what they want, and you cannot cross them up. People who are trained in the art of crossing people up on national television are flummoxed by these kids. Like, how is it that I can't play them the way I play most of my guests? Because they are ready.
Yes, they are.
And if you have another group of people like this coming up, then you can't control the board the way you would want to. Because they have something to say about it, and what they have to say is rational, is cogent, and is timely. And so you can't turn the argument on its head the way you would like to. If you teach American children, what it is that they deserve, you won't have situations where you're voting people into office who decide they want to bankrupt your state government. I always think about the state of Kansas, how they voted for an administration in their state government that basically bankrupted the state government to the point where they could only afford to have school 4 days a week. Yes. What are you thinking that you feel like it's okay that the students in your state go to school only 4 days a week because you can't afford to hold class a fifth day? That says something about you. But because you have a certain set of things that you are focusing on, the shiny object, the hubcap, as it were, of social policies, then you will allow them to do all those kinds of things under the guise of you being the moral majority. But is it moral to sentence students to a 4-day school week and the fallout from that because they never will get the education that maybe you or your foreparents got? Are they not the ourselves and the posterity that we refer to in the preamble of the Constitution? Apparently not. And so the idea that we won't change the funding structure. Now, here's another thing. In schools in areas that are considered to be safe, and that never happens here, you end up having these school shootings. Columbine, Colorado, Columbine High School, and what was it? Lakeland, Colorado, right? Middleton, I'm sorry, thank you. This was a place where that kind of thing doesn't happen here. This is a safe area. In a lot of the schools in the city where I grew up, they had metal detectors at the doors because these kids are dangerous. We need to make sure they don't come up in this school with anything that's going to hurt me or anybody else. I defy you to tell me about a school shooting at one of the high schools in Manhattan. New York City is overwhelmingly black, its school system anyway. I defy you to tell me about a school shooting. But in Middleton, Colorado, up in Connecticut, where all the elementary school kids were killed, this is a place where crime just doesn't happen here where it's safe.
Virginia Tech.
Virginia Tech. So one day I was sitting thinking, I was like, well, why don't they just put metal detectors at these schools and not make it an issue? And my friend was like, listen, you don't want to criminalize these children. You don't want to make them feel like they're wrong. You don't want them to get into their feelings and feel like you're thinking about me in the wrong way, because after all, this is a white space. And I am a member of the community. I know, I'm going back to New York tonight. It's okay.
Well, in the state of, in the great Commonwealth of Virginia, we have 400,000 people that have no insurance, no health insurance. And we have a legislature who still will not vote
To spend my tax dollars, which I won't spend.
Right. On Medicaid expansion. Even though every hospital and every physician and everybody else has tried to get, we have some Republicans now that are supporting it. But our own in our county doesn't support it.
Right. I always ask, like, if you point to 400,000 people who don't have medical insurance, and I wonder how many of those 400,000 people voted for the people who are blocking their access to that. I'm sure it's probably the same proportion as the people in Kansas who voted for Sam Brownback and the people in that state legislature who basically take their state government's treasury. So I don't really know what I can say about that other than the obvious, which is you are the sum of your choices, and one of your choices is your voting pattern. Yes?
I want to get back to the school to prison pipeline, if we may.
Yes, ma'am.
I know you speak all over the place, and I'm wondering if you've seen any programs that work to break the school to prison pipeline.
There are organizations around the country that do this kind of work, like the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. There are smaller organizations based in the several states, and Southern Poverty Law Center, and some based in localities like cities. And they're doing the Lord's work, trying to combat this thing on several levels, because what happens to black people in this country, the justice system happens at several levels that ramify as you go along. So, as I said in the book, it's an avalanche. And once the avalanche gets started, generally speaking, if you see a snow avalanche, once it gets started, who has the power to stop it? Now, if the way things are judged inside a school building are different based on your skin color, then the way the police approach you and deal with you is different based on your skin color. Then the way that the charging officer at the police department or whatever decides they're going to put charges on you, then the DA at the point, like the state of Missouri, as I mentioned in the book, the state of Missouri enacted a law January 1st, 2017 that said that any fight in any school in the state of Missouri was a Class E felony, which means that you, as a second grader, having a spat over crayons or colored markers can become a felon before your 8th birthday.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's right.
Now, although those laws, these, what do they say, zero tolerance policies, are meant to be color neutral, we know that in effect, they are very much targeted to color. Because again, the teacher is deciding who is a playful scamp and who is a hulking thug. So at that moment, in that room, there is a judgment made. When you take it to the principal's office, whether they decide to deal with that referral in-house or turn it over to the police. Now, in Missouri, they don't have any leeway. If somebody says you got in a fight and they refer it, it automatically goes to the police and you are automatically remanded to custody. No matter how young you are, you do not get to go home with a parent. Now, if you are a felon, what does that mean about your life's trajectory? You can't get a job, you can't vote. In a lot of places, depending on where it is, you can't live.
That's right.
So if you are 8 years old and you have a felony record, what does that mean for your life's trajectory before you even hardly got a chance to understand how to jump rope at recess? But again, if you have the prison industrial complex as a growth industry and you are desperate for bodies to fill those systems because they know, researchers have figured out that if you are suspended and or expelled multiple times, the chances that you will in fact become a person who is in the criminal justice system go up sharply. They know this already. So the idea that certain things are happenstance, Yes, ma'am.
Listen, hi. I just wondered if you've written, because I haven't read anything you've written, have you written on the abortion rates of black children?
No, I have not. First of all, this is my first book. My second book is coming out later this year.
Okay. So would you like to make any comments on that?
About abortion, what I'll say is this.
Among the black
What I'll say is this. I am pro-life, not pro-birth. And I'll explain the difference as far as I'm concerned about that. In my own personal life, I would not like to, if I created a life, have it aborted. But I am not pro-birth in so much as I feel like other people should not have the right to make that decision for themselves. And then I make the hypocritical stance of not going out, because I feel like if you stand outside of an abortion clinic shouting invective at a young woman who has a difficult decision to make, you need to be able to prove that you have adopted a child yourself. You need to be able to prove that it is your determination with everything that you have to support people who are poor and struggling and have children that they can barely support and can't afford to get decent child care for. So that's why I say I'm pro-life, but I'm not pro-birth. Because most of the people who call themselves pro-life are actually pro-birth. They want you to give birth to that baby, but they could give a damn about that baby once it gets here. And they don't care about the mother either. So let's be clear about that. So if you want to know how I feel about that, you can quote me. You can say Will Jones said that. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm really enjoying the presentation, and one of the things that I like the idea that Black Lives Matter too. because people, when they see this Black Lives Matter, they think we're saying that other lives do not. But clearly we're saying that what has happened in America, it seems to appear that Black lives do not matter. And when you look at the young man in the Waffle House that killed 4 people, he was taken alive.
Right.
Darlin Root was taken alive.
And I was wondering whether they were going to take him to White House, to a Waffle House for a meal.
People overseas, he was taken alive. The young man in the theater, he was taken alive.
Right.
We're shot in our yards without a thought.
Right.
We are hawking, we are menacing. I told my daughter called me a few minutes ago.
Wait, let him finish his point. Let him finish his point.
My daughter called me a few minutes ago and I couldn't talk to her because I was in this presentation. But what she said, that the shooting of at a Tennessee Waffle House and its aftermath says something about America. What it says: a white shooter, people of color brutally murdered, a black gunless hero saving strangers, a silent president, no call by Fox News to ban angry young white guys, no white evangelicals, television people talking to social media to condemn the evils of racism and the danger of gun proliferation, nothing about the victims of color, not a doggone word from GOP leaders, barely any cursory thoughts and prayers for the dead, not a word from the president praise for the black man who's saved countless lives. America, we have a problem with morality, we have a problem with hypocrisy. I live in Lancaster County. We probably have less than 8 or 9 black teachers in a school system that's 60% black. The superintendent's going to say, we're trying. I'm not doubting that they're not trying, but if you're trying to recruit black teachers, you have to go to where they are. You have to go to the HBCUs in our state. You go all the way to Pennsylvania and bring back some good teachers, but they're coming here because they cannot teach you at our school in Pennsylvania. So they'll come here for 2 years and get some training, and they're gone. We have a revolving door, a revolving door. So we all know what the problems are. We need to kind of try to come up with some solution. I think the solution for the school system is to go to the school board and preach diversity. If you think diversity is a problem here on earth, what's going to happen when you get to heaven? Well,
that's what I say. I say that.
We have to. Well, you cannot have white teachers constantly in front of these young black boys, stifling their imagination, putting out their fire. If you go into a classroom, and I'm sure you know, sir, at the 2nd grade, you got eager little kids ready to, I know, teacher, I know. But what happens by the time they get to 3rd or 4th grade? The fire's completely out. I think they've been beaten down because you have the same kinds of people looking at the same kinds of phenomena is making decisions about what's good and what's bad.
Right.
Yeah. So I really like when we get in these kinds of discussions, if we can somehow, I know there's no panacea, you're not going to find solutions everywhere, but we got to think in terms of what can we do as individuals in our churches, in our communities to make a difference. I think we got to do it one person at a time. I can explain it to you, but I can't make you understand it. But I have to keep trying. I have to keep trying with my neighbors. I have to keep trying with my friends at the country club. I have to keep trying with my people at the baseball, softball game. We have to try one person at a time, because if not, all's going to happen next month or whenever, we're going to come back, have the same setting. We're going to have a excellent presentation from a presenter, but we're not going to have a solution of how we're going to go and make it happen. So some kind of way when we have these kind of discussions, I really would like if we can come up with solutions, or maybe something to start going towards, because we all know what the problems are. We've all seen them. We all experienced them. We all read about them. But what are the solutions that we can try to come up with?
Well, you bring up something that triggers something in my mind between what you were saying and what this gentleman said. white spaces. You mentioned that next month we're going to be here, we're going to convene, and we're going to have a presenter. How frequently does this discussion, this tearing apart of our set of understandings and our modalities happen in white spaces? Because this is a black space. So how often does this thing convene in white spaces? How many times does it convene in the white churches in the area?
Well, we started it in a white church, and we had the early meetings early on in a white church.
Right.
And people were saying, why are there so many white people here coming to these meetings and so few black people coming to the meetings? And suggested, well, maybe if we had it in a black church, we could get more black people to attend.
Okay.
And so we moved it here to Mount Olive.
That's interesting. Why do you think people...
And I want to say something.
Okay, so let me just ask her a question and I'll get right to you. Why do you think that there was such a paucity of black people attending an event about race at a white church?
Okay, they said it, white space, okay.
Okay, go ahead.
But I came over here, I've been only to 4 meetings.
Right.
And I came over here hoping to be among a group, and possibly primarily black.
Okay.
And every time I've seen this group, and I love this group, this is a fine group,
Right.
but there are not enough black people here.
Right.
We all agree.
Okay, so let me talk right to that point, because you remember I stated my qualifications at the beginning. I told you that I've been black for more than 40 years, right? So I know a little bit about how black people think and how they react to stuff like this. When you grow up in an environment, and that includes everywhere you go, from school to your job to other places where you happen to be, the discussion of race in America features a plethora. It's the main dish. It's not a side dish. It features a main dish, which is yeah, but.
It's what?
Yeah, but. Yeah, but.
Yeah, but.
When I go on Facebook and somebody starts having a conversation about race, yeah, but. You mention a historical fact, yeah, but. Why is this happening? Why are police shooting black men? Why can a white man kill 9 people at a church in South Carolina and not only be captured alive but be taken to Burger King, but a black man standing talking on his cell phone in his grandmother's backyard is gunned down like a dog? Yeah, but what about Chicago? What about black on black crime? So the fear, although it might necessarily not go to what it is that you are doing here, and you all seem like lovely people, their experience thus far has taught them that when they meet white people on the field to discuss race, people come prepared with their long list of yeah buts. People come with their long list of, but not me though. And if you can't hear me and you can't deal with, what did I say earlier, Kubler-Ross said, there's 5 stages of grief. We are grieving and never get a chance to fully grieve things that happened long ago and things that are still happening because America does not want to deal with our anger. We have a justified, righteous anger over what happened and what is happening. And usually when you come to discussions like this, and I applaud you all for being open.
I do too.
You get, yeah, but. You get, but what about, and you get, not me though, and you get people breaking down into white tears over the fact that I feel attacked. because you're talking about this and you're making it seem like I'm a racist and I'm here because I'm trying to da. And so the things that we need to get off of our chest and tell America about itself and share with you about our experiences as black people that you don't know because you don't experience that. You may have a black friend, but even though you got a black friend and you all may be cool and you may have gone to school together and you may have known each other for decades, you still do not fully know what that person has had to deal with over the course of a life lived as a person in this kind of skin. And the fact that you would think that you do says that you need these sessions a lot. And black people, by and large, are not here for your playing catch up on their time. Because they spent a lot of time dealing with the boss who doesn't treat them fairly, won't pay them the same, won't give them the same privileges at work. The teacher who treated this kid better and gave them a recommendation for college and wouldn't give me one. Although my grades were better and my behavior and my performance was better, they're tired.
Sick and tired.
Yes. And when they get up every morning and there's a fresh insult to who they are as humans because they see that the person who shot up the Waffle House was brought in safe and sound with less injuries than the person who grabbed the gun from them and kept them from killing more people, they are tired. They are hurt. They are grieving. They are angry, but they know they cannot express their anger to you because they recognize that if they fully uncork that anger, they honestly feel like you will turn and run. They honestly feel like they will begin to see the flow of white tears. And they honestly feel that over a life lived as a black person in America, who knows whether the flow of those white tears will invoke the presence of white power, like it appeared at Starbucks, like it appeared at the golf course, like it appeared when I was in college, when one of my white classmates was waxing stupid about something. We were taking a class in black psychology, and we were talking about issues related to the differences in the way black children and white children are reared based on the historical imperatives of the United States, because black people have to know about white people as a matter of survival, whereas the converse is not true.
That's right.
And when she stood up and said something stupid, of course, I ate her up verbally, but I did not move from my seat. I just told her how crazy I thought she was. Well, lo and behold, after the next class session, my professor pulls me aside and said, you know, she came to my office and told me that you made her feel. Notice I said feel. You made her feel attacked. And that she was threatened. Fortunately for me, it happened to be a black professor. So he was a clinical psychologist. And so he understood, although we didn't have that term back then, he understood white tears. And that was the only buffer keeping me from having to show cause for why I threatened this girl with my words about objective facts versus her feelings.
Then what's the answer?
I don't know. You got to carry the one. I always miss it.
But what is the answer? Someone was asking, so how do we have these conversations more, and how do we engage more people?
I tell you what, I will say this. In all honesty, people like Pastor Williams and people like Sister Vashti have an important role to play in that, in terms of sharing with the black people and the black community that, listen, I know what you're thinking. And I know you think you're going to come here and hear some kumbaya, and if you turn from that and you have some real hard truths and some discussion about things that make things uncomfortable, that we're going to end up having this crazy thing that's going to make us, that if you see one of these people at McDonald's next week, it's going to be like, I know what you're thinking, but I need you to come and I need you to see that we do things just a little bit different. America is still what it is.
Yes.
Fox News is still going to be what it is when you wake up in the morning.
Yes, it is.
ABC is still going to be what it is. CNN, MSNBC, they're still going to be what they are. But at least you can have the opportunity in front of white people to speak your absolute truth. And I told myself when I drove down here from New York at 2 o'clock this morning, I'm not driving down here to hold it back. I'm going to tell you my absolute truth. Number one, because I'm getting back on the road tonight. I'm going back to New York. But even if I had to be here, it does me nor you any good for me to sugarcoat this. Because America has had more than its share of sugarcoating. America is diabetic with the sugarcoating it has got about the issues of race. What's his name? Paul Laurence Dunbar wrote a poem a century ago. We wear the mask. And basically what it's about is black people in this country having to, as a matter of survival, push down and hold down their anger, their sense of injustice, and the sense of everything about this nation that claims to be certain things, but in everyday practice is a whole set of other things, and we can't talk about it. We can't even fix our face wrong. Otherwise, we're called uppity and are subject to be killed. You could have somebody lie on your child and have them arrested and killed. You could have somebody say that your child wolf whistled at them in a store and your child is found tied to a fan blade at the bottom of a river. You know what I'm talking about, right? And so, knowing that history and knowing our contemporary standing in a place where our chief executive talks about the places where we hail from, although we don't know exactly where we hail from, as shitholes. There you go. I'm glad you said it. I didn't want to say it. I'm trying to be good.
What I wanted to add, Willie, is that we have had some tough subjects, and I want to make sure that everyone realizes that those individuals in this room who are white had to deal with white privilege, hard, had to deal with white fragility. In other words, the white tears, they heard it straight, and they had to deal with it, and they dealt with it. I mean, some hard subjects
and I
that
applaud
they
you.
had,
Yeah.
but they dealt with it.
I applaud you. But the question is, when Uncle Bob is at the Thanksgiving table, when Marge in accounting is trying to cook up something on your other coworker who happens to be black, when Carol in HR is playing games with resumes and you happen to find out about it, what do you do? What do you do with what you learn here? Because it's good to come here and participate in discussions and you wear your invisible badge of, I'm not a racist. That's great. I'm glad that you're here because you need to hear this. Everybody needs to hear what's going on in this room, black and white. Because there's plenty of black people that need to be educated in this because they need to be able to talk about it in a way that matters and makes change more likely to happen. Because there's plenty of black people who don't really understand how to define racism, don't know how to define white supremacy in a way that matters. So they get caught up and fumble and stumble, and then they get the hook. And this person who's deflecting and trying not to deal with it gets to walk away feeling like, see, I know what I'm talking about. One of the things that I say a lot is that we've heard that you can't effectively deal with a problem until you admit it. But I say you won't admit a problem if you don't want to deal with it.
That's right.
And so I'm glad that we're here admitting the problem so that at least we can get the beginnings of dealing with it.
I'm sorry if anybody's going to be upset with me, but I hate Al Sharpton. Where is that can take it and really relate to, I'm sorry, I really just.
I'm glad she said that. I'm glad she said that. And, you know, it's important that we get that out because one of the things that, if you understand the history of race relations and the leaders of movements for black people in the United States, is that at one time or another, all of them were hated. Before he died, Martin Luther King was hated. He was hated. Malcolm X, hated. Marcus Garvey, hated. Roy Wilkins, hated. W.E.B. Du Bois, uppity Negro, hated. Not by you, but by his contemporaries in the United States during his lifetime, hated. And so I say this about Reverend Sharpton.
I'd have marched with King if I'd have been there.
You know what?
But Al Sharpton,
I'm glad that you said that. I always say this. Probably about 10 times the number of people who were alive in America in 1960s marched with Dr. King as actually did. I'm always meeting somebody of a certain age who tells me they marched with Dr. King, when in fact, most white people and most black people did not support what Dr. King was doing because of American myth making. And so for you today to say that I understand you don't necessarily jibe with Reverend Sharpton and he doesn't resonate with you personally, but again,
look what he said about Brown. Oh, hey,
this
he
is
just stole some cigars.
right.
Like,
This is exactly what J. Edgar Hoover said about Martin Luther King. What you just said about Al Sharpton is exactly what J. Edgar Hoover said about Martin Luther King. So I'm sorry to leave it. This sister had a point. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
All I was going to just say is that I went to a mental health conference, and on the Yale University website in the mental health section, they told us that there's the 3 B's, and there is a study that they did on preschool, and it's called the 3 B's, is where they did a study of all the preschools in the United States, and the 3 B's, and where they start judging our children as early as preschool, and the 3 B's are, and the one is big, black, boy. And that's where they start judging our children, and they show how they start expelling our children right in preschool. And that study is on there, and if you ever want to look at it, and they show you, and they actually followed children. They have a study on it for 20 years, how they followed those children. And like you said, whether they went to the prison system. So as you were talking about that, if you ever want to look at that, that is the studies on Yale.
Well, as a movement teacher from the north to north.
We're going to be here forever.
Okay, so Pastor's got to bring this train to a stop because it is now 10 after 8.
And you got a long drive.
And I've got a 7-hour drive at some point tonight. So
let's all give Brother Willie.
Thank you very much.